So let's look at how we can classify compounds. By classifying the compounds, we'll be able to name them better and predict the types of reactions that they will do. Before we do that, let's just do a quick review of how we classified matter in Unit 1. So first off, we had to decide if something was pure or a mixture. If there was a mixture, it had two things. It could be homogeneous or heterogeneous. If it was pure, it was either an element or a compound. We're going to be focusing on compounds today. Under the elements, we had two types. They were monoatomic and diatomic. Under the compounds, the two types that we're going to have are going to be ionic and molecular. So really quickly, elements are composed of only one type of atom. Compounds have two or more types of atoms. Mixtures have two or more substances blended together. So in summary, compounds are composed of two or more elements that are chemically bonded, and they can be ionic or they can be molecular. To help us distinguish what type of compound we have, we need to know what type of bonding is present. There are two common types of bonding, covalent bonds and ionic bonds. Covalent bonds occur when electrons are shared, and they happen when there are nonmetals present. Ionic bonds happen when electrons are given and taken, not shared, but one gives and one takes, and these have charges, and ionic bonds will have a metal or ammonium present in their formula. The two major types of compounds are molecular and ionic. Molecular compounds are made up of things that have covalent bonds. Ionic compounds are made from things that have ionic bonds or have ions present. So let's look at how we can use the formula to find out which type of compound we have. Okay, so we determined that ionic compounds are made of ions and have ionic bonds. We know that molecular compounds are made of molecules and have covalent bonds. How can we tell from the formula which is which? The easiest thing for us to do will be to look at the first element listed. We're going to look at ionic compounds first, and I want you to tell me what type of element we have listed first. So these are my ionic compounds. Let's look at them closely and see what element they start with. Sodium, metal. Potassium, metal. Magnesium, metal. N, that one's a nonmetal, so that's a little unusual. Then we see mercury, metal, lithium, metal, copper, metal, potassium, a metal, sodium, a metal, nitrogen again, a nonmetal, aluminum, a metal, magnesium, a metal, and iron, a metal. So we know that they start with metals. That seems to be pretty consistent, except for nitrogen. What I should notice about the nitrogen is it has 4 hydrogens right following it. That tells us that this is ammonium, not ammonia, not nitrogen, but ammonium. As ammonium, we know that that is an ion. It is a polyatomic ion. It is the only one that is positively charged. So what we can say in summary is that ionic compounds will start with a metal or ammonium, and that's how we can know that it's an ionic compound. Here's our molecular compounds. Notice that they start with hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, carbon, a nonmetal, nitrogen, a nonmetal, nitrogen, a nonmetal, phosphorus, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal, hydrogen, a nonmetal. I did do a lot of hydrogen ones, I apologize. Carbon, a nonmetal, carbon, a nonmetal, sulfur, a nonmetal, and iodine, a nonmetal. I want to just focus really quickly on the two that have nitrogen, so here in the middle. The ones with nitrogen, notice that they do not have the 4 hydrogens following them. That tells us that this is still a molecular compound. If it had 4 hydrogens with it, it would have been ionic. So that's how we tell our ionic and our molecular compounds apart. So to summarize, we know that ionic compounds are made up of ions, they have ionic bonds, and they start with a metal or ammonium ion. Molecular compounds are made up of molecules, they have covalent bonds that hold them together, they start with a nonmetal, except for the ammonium ion. And so now we can add into our chart, we have a pure compound, we know it's ionic or molecular because we asked the question, does it start with a metal or ammonium? If it does start with a metal or ammonium, then it must be an ionic substance. If it does not start with a metal or ammonium, then it is a molecular compound. The first step in classification is to identify the compound as ionic or molecular. In order to do that, you need to identify whether the first element is a metal or ammonium or a nonmetal. For this process, I'm going to write N or M under the first element to say whether it's a metal, I'll put an M, or N, N-O-N, for nonmetal. Then, on the left side, I'm going to put I for ionic or M for molecular. So let's begin. We have SiO2. The first element is a nonmetal, so NON, and then we're going to say that that means it is a molecular compound. Nonmetal means it's a molecular compound. The next one we're going to do is lithium hydroxide. So it has Li. Li is a metal, so that means this is an ionic compound. Next, we're going to put phosphorus pentachloride, so PCl5. We'll start with P, which is a nonmetal, which tells us that this is a molecular compound. And the next one I'm going to do is tin for chloride, and that starts with tin. Tin is a metal, so we're going to put that as an ionic compound. I'm going to have you pause the video to do the rest of them. Here we see hydrogen is a nonmetal, so that makes this a molecular compound. Next we have silver is a metal, and that makes this a ionic compound. And next we have magnesium is a metal, so it's an ionic compound. Sorry, I apologize, there's that twice. So magnesium, again, the metal, so it's ionic. Then we have hydrogen. The hydrogen is a nonmetal, so it's molecular. Then we have nitrogen. Notice that it has 4 hydrogens that follow it. That tells us that this is ammonium. This is an ionic compound. Next we have hydrogen as our first element. That's a nonmetal, so it's a molecular compound. Then we have Hg, which is mercury, and that is a metal, so this is a ionic compound. And finally we have Fe, which is a metal, iron, and that is a ionic compound. How did you do? Each of the types of compounds that I've mentioned have 2 classes underneath them. So ionic compounds have bases and salts. I'd like you to look at the compounds and see if you can identify what is in common with the bases. So first note that these all start with a metal or ammonium. Then afterwards I want you to see what they're ending with. Pause the video while you write the answer. That's right, they all ended with hydroxide. So one of the things that we know is ionic compounds start with a metal or a nonmetal, and bases, which are a class of ionic compound, all end with hydroxide. So what about the salts? What do they end with? So look carefully and see if you see any pattern. Most likely you don't. The major pattern is these compounds are ionic because they start with a metal or ammonium, and they end with anything other than hydroxide, and that makes them a salt. So what we call a salt, and table salt, is not all of the salts. In this course, all of the salts include anything that starts with a metal or ammonium and ends with anything except for hydroxide. Molecular compounds also have 2 classes of compounds. They are acids and covalent compounds. So let's look at how we can compare those. Again, we're going to look at the formula to see if we can figure out what the similarity is. So when you look at the acids, what do you notice? What do they start with? Yeah, that's right. They all start with hydrogen. So that makes it pretty easy to find the acids. They are molecular compounds, and they all start with hydrogen. Now let's look at the covalent compounds. What do you notice about them? Well, there's a lot of different ones, right? So they have a lot of different things they can start with, but they're all made of nonmetals. That's why we know they're molecular. And the major rule is they don't start with hydrogen. So covalent compounds contain a lot of different ones, but acids only start with hydrogen. Covalent compounds start with anything other than hydrogen that is a nonmetal. There is one exception to this rule that we must recall, and that is water. It does start with H, it's H2O, but it is not an acid. Water is considered a covalent compound, and it does not follow the rules, so it needs to be memorized separately. So water is a covalent compound. So let's summarize all of that. We know that ionic compounds start with a metal or ammonium. We know that they have ionic bonds. The two classes of ionic compounds are bases and salts. Bases end with OH, or hydroxide ion, and salts end with any other anion. Remember, anion is a negatively charged group. On the other hand, we have molecular compounds. They start with nonmetals and end with nonmetals. The bond type is a covalent bond. They can have two classes. They are acids and covalent. Acids are any molecular compound that starts with hydrogen. Covalent compounds are any molecular compound that starts with anything except for hydrogen. And we add in our one exception, and that is water is a covalent compound. Did you know that IBS, also known as irritable bowel syndrome, could come from a Big Mac? Well, that's not exactly true, but it is a way for me to remember which classes of compounds come from which type. So here's how I remember it. I stands for ionic, B stands for base, S stands for salt. IBS. Ionic compounds are bases or salts. So MAC. M stands for molecular, and the two classes of compounds that come from that are A for acid and C for covalent. So just remember, IBS comes from eating Big Macs. Okay, not really. Now let's practice this. So what we're going to do is you're first going to identify whether you have a metal or non-metal. And again, underneath the first element, I'm going to write M for metal or non for non-metal. Then to the left of that, we're going to put in whether the substance is ionic or molecular. Ionic ones will be the ones that start with metals. Molecular ones will be the ones that start with non-metals. And to the right of the compound, we're going to write in whether the compound is an acid, we'll use the letter A, base, the letter B, a covalent compound, the letter C, or a salt, the letter S. So remember, we use IBS, comes from Big Macs, and that mnemonic reminds us that if it's an ionic compound, it's going to be either a base or a salt, and if it's a molecular compound, it's going to be either an acid or a covalent compound. I'll do the first few of them, and then you can set up the rest. So looking at silicon dioxide, we see that it starts with silicon, which is a non-metal. Non-metal means it's molecular. The two choices for a molecular compound are acid or covalent. If it's an acid, it's going to start with H. This does not start with H, so it's a covalent compound. The second one, we have lithium hydroxide. Lithium is a metal. That tells us we have an ionic compound. Then we look to see if it's ionic, it has the choice of base or salt. If it's a base, it needs to end with hydroxide. This does end with hydroxide, so we have a base. The next one is phosphorus pentachloride. And so we're starting with phosphorus, which is a non-metal. It is a molecular compound. The choices for molecular compounds are acid or covalent. Acids start with H. This one does not start with H, so it is a covalent compound. The next one starts with tin, which is a metal. Metal means it's ionic. Ionic has base or salt. If it's a base, it has to end with hydroxide. This does not end with hydroxide, so this is a salt. Now pause the video, try the rest of them, and see how you do. Okay, so we have the next one, just hydrogen periodate. You do not need to know how to name it. Starts with H, so it is a non-metal. That means it is molecular. It has the choice of acid or covalent. It starts with an H, so that's an acid. And then we have silver acetate. Starts with silver, which is a metal. That means it's an ionic compound. If it's an ionic compound, it has the choice of a base or a salt. If it's a base, it needs to end with hydroxide, and it does not end with hydroxide, so we have a salt. All right, next we have magnesium hydroxide. Magnesium is a metal. That means it's an ionic compound. Choices for ionic compounds are base and salt. This one ends with hydroxide. That means this is a base. Next one, hydrogen borate. Hydrogen is a non-metal. This is a molecular compound. Molecular compounds can be either acids or covalent. Starts with H, so this is an acid. And the next one, ammonium bisulfate, starts with ammonium, but really starts with a nitrogen. That is a nonmetal, but it has 4 hydrogens that follow it. So this one is the oddball one. Starts with a nonmetal, but we're going to say it's a metal plus ammonium. So this one's our specialty one. That tells us that it is an ionic substance. Ionic substances have the choice of base or salt. This one is not a base because it doesn't end with OH, so this must be a salt. The next one's a little bit tricky. So we're going to see that it starts with H, which is a nonmetal. That means it's molecular, and it has the choice of being an acid or covalent. Now, I've told you that anything that starts with H is an acid, and that is a minor lie. The actual truth is water is not considered an acid. Acids are acidic. Water is neutral. So water is an exception to the rule where water is a covalent compound. And that's just an exception to the rule. There are no other exceptions on that rule. The next one is, we start with mercury. Mercury is a metal. That means it's an ionic compound. The choices are base or salt. This is going to be a salt because it does not end with hydroxide. And our last one, FeBr3, that should have a 3 there. The Fe is a metal. That means it's ionic. Our choices are base or salt. It does not end with hydroxide, so that means this is a salt. Hopefully that's enough practice. There is more practice online for you. So let's look at this visually. If we look at all compounds, they can be classified as ionic or molecular. The ionic ones start with metals. I put it to the left on this so that you could see it. The ones that start with metals or ammonium are on the left-hand side, just like on the periodic table, the metals are on the left side. Underneath the ionic compounds, we're going to see that the 2 choices are bases and salts. I listed the bases first, partly because of my mnemonic, IBS, but partly because it's easier to identify the bases first, because the bases end with hydroxide, whereas the salts end with all kinds of different endings. Now let's look at our molecular compounds, which have covalent bonds. They start with a nonmetal, not ammonium, and they can be classified into 2 subsets. Those 2 classes are acids and covalent. Acids, I'm going to list first, again, because it's a little bit easier and because it works with my mnemonic of Big Mac. This is the Mac part, and we'll see acids start with hydrogen, so anything that starts with a hydrogen except for water is going to be an acid. And if it starts with any other nonmetal except for hydrogen, it's going to be a covalent compound, but we also include water as a covalent compound. And that's kind of a summary of our compounds.